The bell above the door of Thorne's Hardware didn't just ring, it announced a legacy. For 58-year-old Elias Thorne, that copper chime was the heartbeat of his existence, a sound that had echoed through aisles of cedar and steel since he was a boy, synchronized with the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. The air inside was thick with the scent of sawdust, machine oil, and metallic tang. It was a sensory sanctuary where floorboards groaned under the weight of history and the stories of 1,000 local repairs. Elias knew which board on the third aisle would squeak and which light hummed when humidity rose. This knowledge was earned over decades, surviving 3 recessions that had flattened others but left Thorne standing proud. However, as Elias stepped behind the worn oak counter, the silence felt heavier than usual. Outside, the neighborhood was changing in ways that felt increasingly hostile. He looked through the front window, where the gold leaf lettering of his name was beginning to flake. Across the street, the old bakery had been replaced by a generic fitness studio that remained mostly empty, and the corner pharmacy now sat behind a space-available sign bleached white by the sun. The vibrant tapestry of the main street was unraveling, one closed sign at a time. It felt as though a cold wind was blowing through the town, and the air seemed to smell of stagnant change, chilling the small shops that once defined the community's character. Elias pulled the monthly ledger from beneath the counter, his hands calloused and steady, though his heart beat with a rhythmic anxiety. He opened the book to the most recent page. For the 4th consecutive month, the numbers refused to align. The rising rent, a staggering increase imposed by a new management company, loomed over the revenue like a shadow. Regular sales couldn't keep pace with the skyrocketing overhead. He ran his finger down the column of expenses, feeling the weight of the deficit. It wasn't a lack of hard work, but a systemic squeeze designed to crush a business like his. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. His gaze wandered to a framed photograph hanging near the register. It was a black and white image of his father standing in front of the storefront in 1965, holding a ceremonial ribbon-cutting scissor. His father's smile was full of a rugged post-war optimism, a belief that a man's word and a well-stocked shelf were all that was needed to build a life. Elias remembered the day he took over the keys, the weight of the brass in his palm feeling like a sacred baton. He had promised to keep the legacy alive, to ensure the Thorne name remained a beacon of reliability. The dust motes danced in the fading sunlight, oblivious to the quiet tragedy unfolding within these 4 walls. But looking at the ledger now, he felt like he was failing a ghost. The pressure was no longer just about profit. It was about preserving an identity being systematically erased. The stillness of the afternoon was suddenly shattered by the sharp electronic trill of the shop's landline. Elias reached for the receiver, expecting a customer asking about the price of a power tool or checking on an order. Instead, the voice on the other end was formal, devoid of the familiar warmth he was used to. It was a tone he had never heard before, a professional coldness suggesting he was no longer a person with a history, but a series of high-risk data points. The caller identified himself as a senior representative from the regional headquarters. As the man spoke, the air in the shop seemed to thin. The words were filled with jargon about equity and immediate reviews that threatened to dismantle his life's work in a single afternoon. Elias's grip tightened on the handset, his knuckles turning white as he realized the battle for Thorne's Hardware had only just begun. The morning after the chilling phone call from the bank, Elias sat in the dimly lit back office, the air smelling of stale coffee and old ink. Across from him sat Mr. Miller, his longtime accountant, who was staring at a stack of spreadsheets as if they were a crime scene. Miller didn't offer a polite smile today. Instead, he spoke with a clinical detachment about the squeeze. It was a term that described the brutal narrowing of the path between rising wholesale costs and the price sensitivity of the local community. Elias listened as Miller explained that the cost of copper piping and pressure-treated lumber had surged by nearly 40%, yet the shop's prices remained tethered to what their neighbors could afford. The margins were thinning to the point of invisibility, creating a financial vacuum that was slowly suffocating the business. The digital divide was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a predatory force felt in every transaction. Elias watched through the office's glass partition as a young man in the third aisle scanned a brand name drill with his smartphone. Within seconds, an algorithm thousands of miles away adjusted a price by a few cents, offering a deal that Thorne's Hardware could never hope to match. These massive online retailers didn't have to pay local property taxes or maintain a physical presence in the community. They operated on volume and data, treating every sale as a tactical maneuver to starve out local competition. Elias felt like a man trying to fight a ghost with a hammer. The world had become a place where convenience was the only currency that mattered, and the personal expertise he offered was being used as a free showroom for faceless corporations. The personal toll of this struggle was etched into the lines around Elias's eyes. As the end of the month approached, he pulled the payroll ledger toward him and made a decision that felt both heroic and hollow. He drew a single, firm line through his own name. To ensure that Marcus and Jim, his two loyal employees who were as close to him as kin, received their full wages, Elias would take no salary for the second month in a row. He thought of his own mortgage and his wife's mounting medical bills, but the thought of telling his staff he couldn't pay them was a weight he couldn't carry. He was sacrificing his own stability to maintain the illusion of theirs, a silent martyr in a fraying apron. This sense of isolation deepened when the supply chain betrayal struck. For 30 years, Elias had dealt with the same regional distributor, a partnership built on handshakes and mutual respect. But that afternoon, a cold voice on the phone informed him that his regular shipment of winterizing supplies had been canceled. A national big box chain had flexed its corporate muscle, securing an exclusive contract that diverted all regional inventory to their suburban warehouses. Elias was being cut off, not because he hadn't paid his bills, but because he was no longer a priority in a world that valued scale over loyalty. He looked at the empty hooks on his walls, feeling the sting of 1,000 small betrayals. In the quiet stretches of the afternoon, internal conflict began to erode his resolve. He stood by the old workbench, his fingers tracing the gouges in the wood made by his father's tools. He wondered if he was simply too old, a relic of an era that the modern world had deemed obsolete. Maybe the coldness he felt wasn't a change in the weather, but the reality of a society that had outgrown the need for a place where someone knew your name. He felt a profound sense of obsolescence, a fear that his values of hard work and neighborhood service were nothing more than beautiful, useless antiques in a digital age. The day ended not with the familiar chime of the door, but with a revelation that turned the floorboards beneath him into quicksand. A certified letter arrived informing him that the landlord had finalized a deal to sell the entire city block. The buyer wasn't another local entrepreneur, but a private equity firm specializing in urban redevelopment. They weren't interested in hardware or history. They saw the land as a blank canvas for luxury condos and generic retail shells. Elias realized then that the bank's call wasn't just about a loan. It was the first tremor of a calculated demolition of his life's work. He wasn't just losing his business. His community was being sold out from under him. Dinner at the Thorne household was no longer the sanctuary it once was. The air in the dining room was thick, not with the comforting aroma of a home-cooked meal, but with a tension that felt heavier than the hardware Elias lugged across his shop floor all day. Across the table, Sarah poked at her roast beef, her brow furrowed in a way that mirrored her father's, though her perspective was worlds apart. She had been the one to break the silence first, her voice calm but clinical, lacking the sentimental warmth Elias desperately craved. She spoke of Chapter 7 and debt restructuring as if she were reading a weather report. To her, the hardware store was a mathematical equation that no longer balanced. To Elias, it was the very marrow of his bones. He watched her, realizing that the American dream he had been raised on, the one where hard work and a storefront guaranteed a place in the world, looked like a fairy tale to her generation. To Sarah, ownership was a burden, a trap that kept her father chained to a sinking ship while the rest of the world moved to the digital cloud. "It's not just a shop, Sarah," Elias said, his voice raspy from a day of explaining to frustrated customers why he couldn't stock the specific plumbing joints they had seen online. "It's a promise. Your grandfather built those shelves with his own hands, and he handed me the keys with the expectation that the Thorne name meant something in this town. I can't just walk away because the wind shifted." Sarah looked up, her pragmatic eyes clashing with his deep-seated sentimentality. "Dad, the wind didn't shift. The entire climate changed. You're working 14 hours a day just to pay for the privilege of being miserable. The dream of the independent shopkeeper is being dismantled by design. We have to be realistic before there's nothing left to save, including your health." The tension hummed between them, a generational rift wider than the dining table. He saw her love for him masked as frustration, and she saw his dedication as a stubborn, dangerous refusal to see the writing on the wall. Late that night, alone in the flickering glow of a desk lamp, Elias stared at a glossy brochure he had hidden in his coat pocket like a shameful secret. It promised instant capital and no credit checks, the siren song of a predatory merchant power loan. The interest rates were astronomical, designed to bleed a struggling business dry while providing only a momentary gasp of oxygen. He knew it was a trap, a deal with a digital devil that wore a corporate elaborate tie, yet the thought of the lights going dark at the shop felt like a death sentence he wasn't ready to face. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, considering a leap that would likely shatter his remaining finances, all for the sake of one more month of defiance. His hands trembled as he gripped the paper, the physical toll of the last few months manifesting as a dull, constant ache in his chest and a persistent cloudiness in his vision that no amount of sleep could fix. The next morning, the world felt even colder, the dawn light gray and unforgiving. As Elias walked toward the shop at the crack of dawn, he stopped in his tracks, his breath hitching. The diner next door, a neighborhood staple for 40 years where the coffee was always hot and the local gossip served as the town's heartbeat, was dark. A simple, hand-scrawled sign hung behind the glass of the front door. Closed for good. Thank you for the memories. Just like that, the pulse of the street had slowed further. The silence that followed was deafening. Without the diner, the sidewalk felt like a graveyard of failed ambitions. The loss of a third place, those vital spaces between work and home where community was forged over eggs and toast, was happening in real time, leaving nothing but an empty storefront and a lingering sense of abandonment that chilled Elias to his core. Elias's pace slowed as he reached the familiar weathered door of Thorne's Hardware. He felt older than 58, his knees clicking with every step and a persistent, heavy exhaustion weighing down his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He reached for the heavy brass handle, a ritual he had performed thousands of times with pride, but something felt wrong. Tucked into the narrow gap between the wood and the glass was a folded white paper, stark and official against the dark grain of the door. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that made his head swim as he pulled it free. The words notice of eviction glared back at him in a bold, heartless font. The private equity firm hadn't even waited for the lease to expire. They had found a loophole, a legal technicality buried in the fine print of a city that no longer valued the little guy. At 5 in the morning, in the pale light of a dying neighborhood, Elias Thorne stood alone, holding the document that signaled the brutal end of his world. Elias didn't retreat. With the eviction notice clutched in a trembling hand, he spent the next 3 days navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Municipal Small Business Administration. He walked through sterile hallways where the air smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner, a jarring contrast to the cedar and oil that defined his life. He carried a folder bursting with decades of tax returns, licenses, and community commendations, hoping they would serve as a shield against the corporate sword. But at every window, he was met with the same glassy-eyed indifference. The clerk spoke a language of codes and subsections, informing him that the emergency grants were reserved for innovation hubs and tech-integrated retail, categories that didn't include a man who sold hammers and knew his customers' children by name. He realized with a sinking gut that the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as intended. The tax laws favored the massive warehouses on the edge of town, granting them decades of abatements, while the little guy on Main Street was taxed on the very square footage the city was trying to reclaim for redevelopment. Back at the shop, the atmosphere was thick with a funereal silence. Elias stood behind the counter, his hands instinctively wiping down a surface that was already spotless. A regular, a man he had helped select the right weather stripping for 20 winners, walked in. He spent nearly half an hour picking Elias's brain about a complex plumbing issue, nodding as Elias sketched a diagram on a scrap of brown paper. But when Elias reached for the necessary brass fittings, the man hesitated, his eyes darting to the smartphone in his hand. "I actually found this exact kit for $15 less on that big site," the man muttered, averting his gaze. "I just wanted to make sure it was the right one before I hit buy. Thanks for the help, though." The bell chimed as he walked out, leaving a hole in the air where loyalty used to reside. Elias felt the betrayal like a physical blow. He wasn't just losing money, he was losing the value of his expertise, discarded like yesterday's newspaper by a world that prioritized a few saved cents over decades of shared history. The hardest moment came that afternoon. Arthur, his oldest employee, a man who had stood beside Elias's father and taught Elias how to calibrate a miter saw, was restocking the shelves. Elias approached him, the weight of the moment making his legs feel like lead. He didn't use a script. He told Arthur he couldn't afford the payroll for the coming month. Arthur stopped, a sheet of sandpaper in his weathered hand, and looked at Elias with a gaze that held no anger, only a profound quiet sorrow. "I know, Elias," Arthur whispered, his voice steady but thin. "I've seen the empty street. It's not your fault the world stopped caring about things built to last." They stood there for a long moment, Two relics in a museum that was being demolished around them. When Arthur took off his apron and folded it neatly on the counter, it felt more final than the eviction notice. As evening fell, Elias walked to the front window. The street was a ghost town, a skeletal remains of a community. The diner was dark, the florist across the way had boards over the windows, and the lack of foot traffic made the silence feel heavy and suffocating. The third place, and the vital social tissue that connected neighbors, was rotting away, replaced by the convenience of invisible warehouses and automated delivery vans. Then, a final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. In the dim light of his back office, Elias cross-referenced the logo on the bottom of the eviction notice with the letterhead from the bank that had denied his loan extension. The private equity firm Apex Urban Holdings was a subsidiary of the very financial institution that held his mortgage. They weren't just foreclosing on him because he was struggling. They were manufacturing the struggle to consolidate the entire block for their own redevelopment project. The bank was the landlord, the judge, and the executioner. The realization hit him with a cold, clarifying fury. He wasn't just a failing businessman. He was a target in a premeditated corporate assassination. Elias moved through the aisles of Thorne's Hardware like a man walking through a memory. The air now carried the sharp sting of finality. He spent the morning pressing orange stickers onto the merchandise. 30% off. 50% off. Each label felt like a small wound he was inflicting upon his own history. The weight of the world felt concentrated in the tip of his marker as he wrote the word final over and over again. This liquidation sale wasn't a surrender, it was a calculated maneuver to ensure his people, those who had stood by him while the walls closed in, didn't walk away with empty pockets. He calculated the margins over and over, ignoring his own mounting debt to ensure that Arthur and the younger staff would receive their final bonuses. He would not let the system strip him of his integrity along with his livelihood. On the second afternoon, the bell above the door gave a sharp, impatient ring. A man in a charcoal suit, his skin looking too smooth for a neighborhood built on grit and sweat, stepped onto the worn floorboards. He was a representative from Apex Urban Holdings. He didn't browse. He surveyed the room with the detached, clinical gaze of an appraiser. He approached the counter and slid a thin, glossy folder toward Elias. The offer inside was an insult, a pittance for the remaining inventory and fixtures, a sum so low it barely covered the cost of the steel in the shelving. The representative spoke of simplifying the transition, his voice as oily as the liquid he likely used to keep his hair in place. He treated Elias not as a business owner, but as an obstacle that needed to be swept away for a more efficient future. Elias looked at the man's hands, clean, soft, and never having known the bite of a cold winter. He looked at the folder, then back at the rows of tools that had helped build half the houses in this neighborhood. A cold fire ignited in his gut. Without a word, he took the folder and slid it back across the scarred wooden counter. He wouldn't let these people profit from his wreckage. He had already made a different arrangement. That morning, he had called the director of the local vocational trade school. Every hammer, saw, and box of hardware would be donated. It was a choice that made no financial sense to a bank, but it made perfect sense to a man who believed in the longevity of a craft. He would rather see an apprentice use those tools to build a future than see them sold for scrap by a private equity firm. As word of the final days spread, the store transformed. It was no longer a place of commerce, but a site of pilgrimage. Neighbors appeared, not to hunt for bargains, but to pay respects. Mrs. Higgins brought coffee, her eyes red-rimmed as she recounted how Elias's father had repaired her doorframe for free after a storm. A group of contractors stood in the plumbing aisle, their voices hushed, speaking of the shop as the nerve center of the street. The bell, which had once sounded like a herald of progress, now rang with the mournful toll of a funeral bell. This was the realization that hit Elias the hardest. Thorne's Hardware wasn't just a business, it was the social fabric of the neighborhood. It was the third place where problems were solved and people were known by their names. By closing these doors, the system wasn't just removing a competitor, it was tearing a hole in the community that a corporate chain could never patch. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the final evening, Elias stood alone. The shelves were skeletal, the shadows long and haunting. He walked toward the back office to retrieve his jacket. As he prepared to leave, his eyes caught a glimmer in the corner of the floor safe. Elias reached into the dark, forgotten corner of the floor safe, his fingers brushing against something that felt far older than the cold metal surrounding it. He pulled out a small, leather-bound book, its spine cracked and its pages swollen with decades of humidity. It was his father's original ledger from the shop's founding year. As he flipped through the meticulous entries written in fountain pen, he found a loose leaf of paper tucked into the very last page. It was a note, written in his father's distinctive looping cursive, dated shortly before the old man had passed the keys to Elias. The words were simple, but struck with the force of a tidal wave. His father had written that the nails and the hammers were just the excuse to get the neighbors through the door. He reminded Elias that they weren't in the business of selling hardware. They were in the business of keeping a community standing. The note concluded with a final piece of wisdom. If the books ever failed to balance, Elias was to check the hearts of his neighbors, for that was where the family's real capital was stored. The weight that had been crushing Elias's chest for months finally began to lift. He realized then that while the private equity firm could take the bricks, the mortar, and the inventory, they could never foreclose on the legacy of service he had upheld. He tucked the ledger into his coat pocket, took one last look at the empty shelves that had defined his life, and stepped out into the cool night air. The click of the lock felt different this time. It wasn't a sound of defeat, but a sound of completion. He walked away from the darkened storefront without looking back, leaving the notice of vacancy to flutter uselessly in the wind. Months later, the neighborhood had changed. A sleek, corporate-branded convenience store now occupied the space where Thorne's Hardware had stood for over 50 years. The windows were filled with digital screens, flashing advertisements for energy drinks and high-interest credit cards. There was no smell of sawdust, only the sterile, chemical scent of industrial cleaner. Customers moved in and out with their heads down, staring at their phones, interacting only with the glowing, unresponsive screens of self-checkout kiosks. The third place, that vital middle ground where neighbors once debated local politics or shared advice on a leaky faucet, had been scrubbed away in favor of cold, transactional efficiency. The void was palpable. The street felt quieter, colder, and more anonymous. The loss of Thorne's wasn't just the loss of a store, it was the erasure of a landmark that helped people navigate their own lives. But a mile away, in the small detached garage behind the Thorne household, a different light was burning. Elias had cleared out the old boxes and installed a heavy, scarred workbench he had rescued from the shop's basement. He didn't have a sign, and he didn't have a corporate charter, but he had a line of people waiting at his door. He had started a small workshop, a place where he taught the neighborhood's youth how to work with their hands, how to respect the grain of the wood, and how to fix what was broken instead of throwing it away. Even Arthur came by twice a week, his weathered hands guiding a new generation of apprentices. Sarah often sat in the doorway, watching her father with a newfound respect, realizing that the American dream hadn't died. It had just been forced to move into smaller, more resilient spaces. This story isn't just about Elias Thorne. It is the story of the 600,000 small businesses that close their doors every year in the face of rising rents and the relentless march of corporate consolidation. When a local business dies, we lose more than a tax-paying entity. We lose a piece of our collective identity. We are trading our community's soul for a few cents of convenience, allowing our main streets to be turned into identical corporate hallways. Elias stood at his workbench, the sun setting behind him. He looked directly ahead, a quiet peace settling over his features. The store was gone, but the spirit of the craftsman remained. The values of loyalty and community were still alive, waiting for a society that was finally ready to value them again. Elias smiled, knowing that as long as he held a tool in his hand, the legacy of Thorne's would never truly be broken.